and it's in the breaking. We come unbound, and it's in the giving. We are found, yeah. You could barely change, and you don't know why.
Welcome to Wisdom and Well-Being, a podcast created to honor the authentic human experience. Seeking to nourish through stories instead of through substance, we offer this space for the telling of a unified narrative where wisdom, hope, gratitude, and love become our sustenance, and community our home in which to receive it.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.
In episode 4 of A Medicinal Mind, Wisdom and Well-Being podcast, I share a conversation with my colleague and close friend, Dr. Stephan Guyenet. As you will hear in the introduction, Stephan was one of the first individuals with whom I was able to connect during my early exploration of ancestral health. After a few short emails, I soon discovered that Stephan's father was actually a professor in my very own medical school, and I would later go on to learn cardiovascular physiology and pharmacology from his kind and brilliant dad. I am indeed indebted to the entire Guyenet family for many aspects of my health education, and I'm so grateful to have crossed paths with them both. But before I dive much further into the specific details of today's show, I want to give you a little glimpse into the life and work of Stephan Guyenet. Stephan received a BS in biochemistry from the University of Virginia, a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Washington, and spent a total of 12 years in the neuroscience research world. His most recent work investigates the neuroscience of eating behavior and obesity. Today, he continues his mission to advance science as a writer, speaker, and science consultant. He currently lives in the Seattle area, grows unreasonable amounts of potatoes, and brews a mean hard cider. In addition to growing potatoes and brewing cider, Stephan recently wrote and released a groundbreaking book on the neurobiology and neuro-regulation of body weight called The Hungry Brain. He has appeared on many podcasts over the past few months, discussing the ideas in his book, focusing on the complexities of understanding human behavior as it pertains to food choice and eating habits. In this conversation, however, we offer a different discussion as we seek to explore and assess the current state of the scientific research community. What are the biggest issues facing the scientific community right now, beyond simply just funding? Are we at a point where we must focus on value-based research and incentivize replication studies over novelty-based science? What are the most prevalent sources of bias in the scientific community, and how are they currently being addressed? Is the scientific community inherently self-correcting? Or is institutional inertia too much to prevent internal improvements and progress? And how about healthcare delivery and medical education? Are the same issues faced by the broader research community affecting medical education and healthcare delivery as well? Are these institutions capable of self-correction? Whether you work or study in the fields of biomedical research, medical education, or something entirely different, as part of this discussion, we offer several new ideas and conceptual frameworks in which to approach your profession, and I encourage you to listen in and share this episode with any of your colleagues who you feel would benefit. Stephan's insights into both the macro and micro issues facing the research community are truly remarkable, and I hope you benefit from his curiosity and his wisdom. Without further ado, let's jump into the show. Well, Stephan, thank you for joining me on this fledgling of a podcast. I've been honored to listen to you talk on numerous podcasts. Chris Kresser, Chris Masterjohn, Rob Wolf. I could just name tons of names in this functional ancestral space, and I'm honored to share a conversation with you. And I think many people in the audience are probably pretty familiar with your work, and recently with your new book. And I love the book, but it was funny. I was thinking, after the fourth or fifth podcast hearing about the book, it was time to maybe have a different conversation, and reached out to see if you were interested. And so here we are. Thank you for joining me, and I guess just let everyone in our audience know a little bit about you and perhaps the book, since it seems to be rather timely.
Okay, good to be here, Rob. Thanks for inviting me. So my name is Stephan Guyenet, and I am a neuroscientist and obesity researcher, or former neuroscientist and obesity researcher. Currently, I primarily do science consulting and writing and other things related to that. My background is in neuroscience and obesity research, and particularly the neuroscience of obesity, so how the brain controls eating behavior and body fatness. I kind of, my path went through a lot of different things to get where I am, but it ended up bringing together some of what my scientific and professional interests are in neuroscience, as well as it brought those things together with some of my personal interests in diet and health. And that came about when I realized that obesity and the eating behavior that generates it is a very important, it is regulated in very important ways by specific brain circuits. So, and this should be obvious really to anyone who has thought about it a little bit. The brain generates all of our behavior. It generates all of our feelings, all of our thoughts. And so obviously our eating behavior, the way we use our bodies, and everything else that could possibly be a determinant of how we eat, how we move, and how much fat we carry, including our physiology, is all regulated by the brain. And so the brain really makes sense. I mean, you can look at obesity from a variety of different angles, but I think there are some angles that are going to be more productive than others. And I think the brain is really the central node in the network that determines all of these things. And it's a very logical place to focus on if you're trying to study obesity. So that's kind of where I come from. And I recently, as you said, wrote a book, The Hungry Brain, and that is kind of like my worldview on the neuroscience of eating behavior and obesity. It's written for a general audience, and it's an exploration of some of these brain circuits that are having a very, very strong impact on our eating behavior that we aren't necessarily in conscious control of and aren't even necessarily consciously aware of often. And I also talk a lot about just how the brain works in general and decision-making processes. One of the things that I think is really cool about the book that I haven't really discussed much in podcasts is, to my knowledge, it's the first general audience book that really explains how the brain generates decision-making behaviors in general. And that's one of the areas that I feel like I really dredged out some cutting-edge science and made it accessible to the public. And that's one of the things I'm most proud of. So besides all that, I also I co-designed a weight loss program with my friend and business partner, Dan Party. It's called the Ideal Weight Program. And although I don't currently have an academic appointment, and so my research activities are limited, I am currently working on a meta-analysis, although I can't really give any more details on that right now.
Well, thank you. After I've read the book, and I come from a scientific medical background, but I agree with you. It's really one of the most accessible books. It's quite unique in the way that it lays out, why are we making the decisions that we're making? And it's not just about eating behavior. Like you say, that's a key component of the book, but you talk about really all these circuits, and I loved the description of different inputs and, the basal ganglia essentially deciding, well, what gets through at this point and why? And if this gets through, what can't be going on at the same time? I think I loved your explanation about, well, if we're going to prioritize eating because we're so hungry, then that drive to, to procreate, to be sexually active is, you can't really do do those at the same time. And so you sort of, inhibit one process while the other predominates. And it seems so logical. And of course we should know about it. But it was the first time it was ever laid out to me in those terms, and it made so much sense. So, yeah, thank you for that sort of explanation and that the effort it took to kind of maybe come down from the scientific, really detail-oriented description and bring it into a more accessible framework for people.
Yeah, that chapter was a tremendous amount of work, partly because it's not an area of expertise for me, and so I had to do a lot of interviews and a lot of reading to feel like I really understood it. And then I had to do a lot of thinking and many different versions to be able to explain it in a way that was understandable to the general public. So that chapter was really a learning experience for me, as well as a learning experience for people who read the book. And my goal in the book was to kind of dig down to the very bottom of the issue and develop a first principles explanation of basically the entire circuit between stimuli in your environment, then going into your brain, get processed, and then yield eating behavior outputs. What does that entire circuit look like? That was kind of my goal with the book. So I'm glad you found that part informative.
Yeah, well, it was fascinating to me. And and certainly we could totally go down that rabbit hole, but I guess I really have to get off my chest. I know I kind of prefaced it at the beginning, being honored to share this conversation with you. Stephan, I think you were the first person in the real early days when I was figuring out ancestral functional approaches to medicine. I'm not exactly sure how I came across your page. It might have been because you were on Chris Crusher's show, and I found your website and I started reading your content, and I saw you had graduated from the University of Virginia, and I was like, well, I'm at the University of Virginia. There's a reason to be friends, no matter how superficial it seems. And reached out to you, and you reached back out to me, and we actually ended up arranging for you to come home. I didn't even realize, your parents were still in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the university, and your dad specifically was teaching in the School of Medicine where I was a student. I hadn't met him yet. I would later learn cardiac pharmacology from your father, and just loved his French accent. Some other of my classmates just they kept having such difficulty trying to understand him say angiotensin receptor and just some of the the more nitty gritty that aldosterone, and but I loved his teachings. But so you were my first real contact in this space, and it was just kind of synchronous that we sort of had the the Charlottesville connection, and it was a lot of fun doing that talk. It's crazy. I think that was over 3 years ago now.
Yeah, that was great for me too. I mean, honestly, that was, I think, one of the best talks I've ever given, and it was cool to have my parents there as well, and to be at my undergraduate alma mater. So I appreciate that opportunity.
Yeah, it was, I think, perhaps in the future you'll have to, when you're home on a, vacation or come back to see your folks, you'll have to come back. I'm not going to be too far away for my residency. I'm still very much connected with folks at UVA. So maybe we'll have to get, part two, because there's so many people who at that university could benefit from some of the concepts in the book. And, but yeah, so, I reached out to you, as we kind of talked about, at the very beginning. I wanted to have a conversation about, and it became relevant to me. I'm kind of losing exactly the weekends. I guess it was 2 weekends ago, the March of Science, or March for Science, and just this outpouring of interest for people to save, research funding for foundational scientific research. And it was kind of surprising on one hand, but also not surprising that we were this motivated to want to keep this space open for people to bring progress to multiple areas. And specifically my background in medicine and your background in sort of nutrition and medical science, I wanted to kind of have a discussion to sort of see what are some of the issues, that are facing our, the scientific community beyond just this, is funding going to be available? It's definitely it'll weave into, I think, our discussion. But I thought it would be really helpful to kind of have this discussion about the scientific community and maybe sort of assess the current state of the union of the scientific process, and maybe more specifically within medical and nutrition science.
Yeah, so first of all, just to comment a little bit about some of the issues that you were talking about earlier. I think, a lot of people are having trouble with the current administration's approach to funding science. And I think the basic problem with cutting off, with reducing NIH funding is that it's a false economy. There's a saying, penny wise, pound foolish. And that captures the essence of the problem here, which is, there are ways to save money that ultimately cost you in the long run. And I think this is one of them. The NIH does receive a lot of taxpayer money. Of course, it's like a drop in the bucket compared to certain other things like Medicare and the military. But it's still a lot of taxpayer money, obviously. But it's a major driver of innovation and American strength on the global economy. And I think that it's a major reason why you have so many brains coming to the United States and bringing innovation and bringing wealth and resources to this country. So I think and the United States by far is the largest producer of research in the world, and especially high quality research, even compared to Europe. And so I think that if we end that, we are severely weakening America's position of strength in the world. And of course, we're crippling, biomedical progress in general. So I think there's a lot of concern right now in the research community and in people who just appreciate research and understand its value as well. And I think that concern is definitely appropriate. So I want to talk a little bit about, obviously from what I'm saying here, it's obvious that I think science is valuable. So I'm not really going to discuss that further. I'm just going to take that as a given. But now I want to talk about some of the problems with science as it's currently practiced. I think we're slowly coming to the realization that the scientific process, while it's very powerful, is not as efficient as it could be. Some people are even suggesting that modern science is in crisis and that it isn't generating reliable knowledge at all. I don't agree with that, but I think it's clear that we're using more money and time than we need to be using to get the right answers. And I think that's always been the case. I don't think that this is something that just happened overnight and science is crumbling. I think, on the contrary, science is a vast collection of methods, and it's self-improving. It's always been self-improving. For example, if you look at the research that was being done 60 years ago, most of the time they weren't even doing tests of statistical significance. They were just presenting data and hoping that the reader's eyeballs would lead them to reliable conclusions. So, and obviously that's changed today. I mean, you can't even get a paper published without having a statistical significance test. So our methods have come a long way, and they will continue to improve as science continues to uncover flaws in itself. And so what are some of the flaws that are currently reducing the efficiency of science? And by the way, I talk about efficiency here because, I mean, that's really what the problem is. I mean, scientific knowledge is continuing to advance. It hasn't stopped. You know, we're still getting useful, reliable, mind-opening information out of science every day. But the question is, are we getting the maximum evidence value that we can get based on the resources that we're investing in it? And I think the answer to that is clearly no, as we continue to identify flaws in the scientific process, some of which are reducing our efficiency, I think, quite substantially. So I have a list of things here that I want to talk about. The first one is pretty straightforward: restricted access to information. So a lot of investigators don't share their methods or their data in a way that is detailed enough to allow replication, which undermines a key aspect of the scientific method. If you can't replicate someone's experiment exactly how they did it, then you can't, it's not really a testable hypothesis. They're not allowing their research to be validated, and that makes it a lot more questionable. And this is really, really common. You know, having done research myself and having written papers, you know, many papers myself, I know that a lot of the times the methods that are reported are not nearly as detailed as you would need to replicate the experiment. And sometimes that's okay, because sometimes the information that's left out is something that a knowledgeable person in the field would know. But that's not always the case. And a lot of times if you want to look at the methods for a particular study, you'll look at the paper, and in the methods section it'll say, instead of telling you a particular method, it will give you a reference to another paper that has that method. Then you look up that paper, and that method section contains a reference to another paper, and you go like 3 papers deep eventually to find out that it's not really what you were looking for. So, I mean, this is really, really common. And the other thing is, I mean, you want your experiments to be replicable by people outside the field too, because science, there's a lot of cross-fertilization in science, and sometimes you need to look at a study and understand at a deep level a study that someone did in a related field or even in an unrelated field. And maybe you would need to replicate that or evaluate that in some way. And so I think it's not really a good policy to be skimpy on your methods and assume that people are going to be able to understand what you mean. So the other aspect of restricted access to information is the fact that a lot of papers can be difficult to access because of paywalls. And this means that scientific information can be restricted for people who need it in the research community, and it also means that scientific information can be restricted for the general public in particular. And I think this is changing a lot. You have a lot of papers are becoming open access. Over the last 10 years, there's been a huge shift toward open access. If you go on Google Scholar, a lot of times you can find PDF links. And there's also the rise of, I'm trying to remember what it's called, Sci-Hub, paper sharing site where basically you can download almost any paper pirated. So I think there's a huge demand for this, and I think it makes a lot of sense because, you know, as a U.S. taxpayer who's paying for this science, it kind of sucks if you're not able to read the papers that are coming from it, so, and this is something that's being addressed by the NIH and by journals. It's being addressed, but it's taking time. So another flaw in our current scientific process that I think is really, really huge, this is possibly the biggest one, and it's bias. And bias can take multiple forms, such as industry influence. I think that's one that everyone's aware of, and kind of gets a lot of attention. But in my opinion, that's chump change next to the biggest source of bias, which is coming from the ambitions of the investigators themselves. So there's a huge amount of pressure to get grants and to get grant money and to publish. And I can tell you, getting grants is hard, and it's getting harder. And especially if they're going to start cutting NIH funding, people spend a third or more of their time, depending, some PIs spend the majority of their time writing grants, most of which are not getting funded. So it's like savage combat to get these grants, It's very, very difficult to get. And so you're going to take any advantage you can to get that money. And then similarly to get your papers published, because getting your papers published is how you get the grants. It's how you get a job. It's how you get a raise. It's how you get acclaim from your peers, which I think is a very important motivator for people in science. And think about what it is to have a lab, to be the principal investigator of a lab. You're like a small business owner, and you have employees that you're responsible for. And if you can't bring money in to pay for those people, they're out of a job. And so I think that there's a tremendous amount of pressure that investigators are under. And you also have to consider that these are some of the most intelligent people in the world competing against one another. So if I'm writing a grant, I have to make a grant that's better than 90% of all these other incredibly intelligent, motivated, driven people. And that is just a very, very difficult thing to do. So people tend to take whatever advantage they can get. And, sometimes advantages are things that are good things, like you got a lucky break on your data, or you had a really good idea. And sometimes they're not so good things, like you're fudging your methods, you're not really thinking clearly about your hypothesis, you're selectively citing the literature, etc. So these kind of pressures can lead to profound bias that leads to bending the methodological rules, suspending disbelief about your findings, etc., etc. And then another form of bias that is related to that is called publication bias. This is also called the file drawer effect. And this is where you have studies that this is where basically, if you're looking at the literature on a question as a whole, people are more likely to publish studies that had big positive effect sizes and not publish studies where they didn't find anything, where there's a negative, or a null, I should say, effect, so no effect. So, you do a study, it shows nothing, you have very little to gain from publishing it, it doesn't support some hypothesis that your career and whatever relies on, and so you're just less likely to publish it. And also, you put it out for peer review, the rest of the field sees it and feels like this is undermining them, and maybe they're going to be harder on it in peer review, so it might even be harder to get it published even if you do try. So there tends to be this distortion that happens in the literature called publication bias, and that's something that can be, at least to some degree, addressed through proper meta-analysis methods. But another method I want to briefly touch on that I think is really, really useful for combating this is pre-registration. So this is one of the most powerful tools for improving the way science is currently done. And basically, what this is, you register your study before conducting it. You say exactly what you're going to do, and you say what your outcomes are going to be, and particularly what your primary outcome is going to be. And then if you do your study and don't publish it, somebody can go look and they can say, oh, I see that there was a study pre-registered here. So, and I'm seeing a lot of unreported, unpublished pre-registered studies. So there's clearly publication bias happening here, but basically allows you to understand, to assess the degree to which that's going on. And it also prevents people from playing around with statistics and outcomes after the fact to get the outcome that they wanted, because they have this pre-registration recorded saying exactly what they were going to do in the study. So they can't just change which outcome they want to report. They can't change their statistical analysis or whatever it is. And I want to say that, again, on the theme of science being self-correcting and this process being already well in motion, I want to say that 15 years ago, barely any randomized controlled trials were pre-registered, and today almost all of them are. I mean, if you want to get a randomized controlled trial published in a high-quality journal, it better be pre-registered or else you're not going to get it in. And that was not at all the case 15 years ago. So, scientists are seeing these flaws and they're working to correct them. And I would say that's probably one of the most encouraging examples in this area. Not all of these areas are being addressed as vigorously, but I think that there is a lot of movement happening and much of it's in a positive direction. Another place that I think science is not as efficient as it could be is in our methods for study design and statistical analysis. They're often inefficient at generating evidence given the resources that are put into the studies. And the methods we do have are often misapplied. So basically, so there's a discipline called Bayesian statistics that may be poised to eventually solve that problem, at least partially. This is basically, it's a fundamentally better way of doing statistics as opposed to having just kind of like a hodgepodge of different statistical tools that we apply to different situations. And so I think that applying Bayesian methods and insisting and failing that, insisting that the non-Bayesian methods that we have are applied correctly and accurately, I think could go a long way toward addressing this problem. And also study pre-registration, because there's this really interesting concept, and this again goes back to that theme of science correcting itself right now, or improving itself, I should say. There's this really interesting movement called registered reports. And this is journals that are signing on to this completely new concept of peer review, where, and this is particularly, by the way, for randomized controlled trials, and I think it started in the psychology literature where there is a really, really bad replication crisis happening right now, where they're finding that a lot of kind of key results are kind of baloney. And so basically what happens with the registered report is what you submit to the journal is not a completed study with all the data and everything. What you submit to them initially is the methods. So you submit to them a detailed account of exactly what you're going to do. And then that gets sent out to reviewers. They review it. They give you all the feedback that they want to give you. And at that point, the journal decides whether your paper will be published. And so basically, then you go and do the experiment, and no matter what the outcome is, whether you got this great big awesome effect or whether it's total null, it's still going to get published. And so basically they're grading you on the quality of your methods, not the quality of your results. And I think that's a really big step forward for combating this problem of publication bias, or the file drawer effect that I was talking about earlier. And it's also a way to really improve methods, improve the transparency of methods, and avoid this situation of submitting a paper to a scientific journal only to have the reviewers trash your methods after you've already done the study. You know, it's a way for the methods to be as good as they can be right off the bat. So I think that's really cool. And then the fourth thing I'll mention, the fourth and final thing, is education. I think that researchers are often not taught best practices for conducting scientific research. As amazing as it is to hear those words leaving my mouth, it's absolutely true. I mean, a lot of what I've learned about study design and analysis, I learned since I left research, as I looked into these things and as I had more time to look into them. And as I started working on the funding end of things with this organization, Open Philanthropy Project, like most graduate students, I was thrown into the deep end of the pool with very little guidance during my graduate studies. And nobody told me about pre-registration. Nobody told me about registered reports. Nobody told me about, I learned almost nothing about proper statistical methods. I learned nothing about declaring primary outcomes. I mean, it really was just kind of the Wild West, figure it out, you're smart, figure it out. And, the truth is smart people can figure it out, but it takes a long time. Like I said, it's an inefficiency. If you tell people right off the bat and you train people to use the best available methods, you can save them 10 or 15 years figuring these things out and being less efficient than they could be in the use of taxpayer dollars and their own time and other people's time and animal lives and all of those things, all of those costs that are associated with science. So it's important to understand that science is progressing on all of these fronts. The problems have been recognized and are in the process of being addressed, although how quickly and effectively those changes will happen remains to be seen. So there you go.
Well, I'm so glad I had you on to, put that out there and, that framework. It's amazing. I'm sitting here, we could unpack this in so many ways. I think, a few things that came to mind. Well, first, as a framework, it's amazing to hear your descriptions, of the scientific and research community. And I'm sitting here and it's like, this sounds so much like just academics and medicine, medical school in general, just this incredibly competitive environment with very brilliant, smart, and passionate people. But one of the things that stood out, and I'll try to keep this organized with the parallels that came to mind, was this concept, and it's been a pretty big component of public health initiatives. I think it's one of the triple aims, is this idea of value-based care in medicine, and what you are sort of describing is value-based research. We need to recognize, we can't spend, $5 million on just any randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, trial to get an outcome. It's, we have to have some metrics of what science is efficient and truly valuable. And they've started to do this in medicine with measures such as like the quality, quality adjusted life year. How much money should we be spending for certain interventions to improve someone's wealth, quality of life, or extending life? And we've kind of come to a recent consensus on a number. It's sort of still kind of subjective, but we have to maybe start setting some metrics as funding becomes so restrictive on what is valuable science. So it's funny, I just saw that. I was like, that's such a direct parallel. And it's I was going to say that's really interesting that you say that, because I think personally that, and I'm not super knowledgeable about healthcare practice in the United States, but
that seems like an area of great need in the United States in particular, is having a cost-benefit analysis of the care that we're providing, because, I mean, costs are, as you know, totally out of control in this country, and particularly relative to other wealthy nations, it's just insane. And so, and I think part of the problem is we have this kitchen sink approach where we're willing to throw these incredibly costly and invasive interventions at people, even when they're barely going to have any impact on survival or well-being. Like, I mean, how much money is it worth to take, a 90-year-old person and do some intensive treatment that's going to extend their life by 3 months? Like, is it acceptable to create a large financial burden on everyone else to pay for that? And I think, people are reluctant to think about things in terms of the cost of a human life because they view human life as sacred. But the truth is that we make cost-benefit calculations about life all the time, about ourselves, about our families. How much are you willing to pay for those new safety features in your new car? I mean, there's a cost-benefit that goes on in your mind, and you are valuing your own life in that cost-benefit. And so it doesn't make any sense to me that we wouldn't do the same in healthcare.
Yeah, it's a conversation that is certainly on the table, and I'm glad that people are willing to have those difficult conversations. Like you said, human life is sacred. So, on one hand, there's no price, there's no dollar sign that you could put in front of it, but maybe for the interest of the well-being of the nation, of the public, we have to at least construct some framework in which to conduct research and to practice healthcare. Another kind of thing that came to mind, similar thinking in the academic medical community is that competition aspect and the overemphasis on novelty. Whether in medicine it's the newest drug or intervention, that bias of it must be better, but just the push for science is progress through novelty rather than progress through replication. And you talked about this really, really well here, this concept of replication, and can you even publish your methods so that we can replicate them? But I see the issue as, well, do we even have funding, or do we promote replication studies? Because as you just mentioned, in trying to get new grants, if you're not looking at some new molecule or some new compound or some new drug, then whoever's delegating the research funding is going to be like, well, that doesn't seem very interesting. Like, we've already answered that question. And you might come back to them and say, well, you're right, we answered that question once. And science is about validation and replication. And if we can't replicate someone's methods independently, then I can't say that that's a truthful finding. It's just kind of up in the air. And so we need, in some way, to incentivize replication of, whether it's in medicine, doesn't matter what field in science, we need to be able to incentivize that. And I kind of make the comparison to this, I'm going into family medicine, starting a family medicine residency program. And we keep hearing, we're going to have this huge shortage of primary care providers. What are we going to do about it? And there's certain programs, and people have talked about, well, can we incentivize people going into primary care by loan forgiveness or public service loan forgiveness, and just different methods to try to alleviate the burden, because the incentive compared to going into a specialty field, in terms of finances anyway, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's like, why would you go into primary care when you could make, thousands and thousands on the spot doing a cardiac catheterization? And so I see, that has the same issue. Well, how do we incentivize people going into that specialty? And we have to be thought leaders to come up with ways to push that. And I don't have definitive answers to that specific question. I guess, more broadly, I'm certainly encouraged hearing about some of the, the research funding, the funding that is being provided. And I think, more broadly, I'm certainly encouraged hearing about some of the research funding, the funding that is being provided. And I think, more broadly, I'm certainly encouraged hearing about some of the, the research funding, the funding that is being provided. And I think, more broadly, I'm certainly encouraged hearing about some of the, measures you describe within the scientific community that are actually fairly new to me, as a way to try to correct for some of the recognized issues. And you use the concept of science can be, in the research community, can be self-correcting. And I see that as, obviously, that to me that's encouraging, because it implies there's not so much inertia in the way that we practice science that we have irreversibly created a scientific process, a community that can't fix itself or requires some external intervention from wherever. And I make the parallel to healthcare delivery and the healthcare system. And have we created such inertia institutionally with how we deliver healthcare that it can't be self-correcting? I am hopeful and believe that perhaps in certain grassroots ways that they come together, just as we saw with the March for Science, in grassroots ways we could potentially overcome some of that incredible inertia to reverse and self-correct the major issues facing healthcare delivery. But I'm encouraged that it's happening in a setting, in a community that I find very much parallels healthcare. I'm making generalizations, but the fact there's a self-correcting process that you outline for the research community, at least to me, gives me hope that self-correction can occur in healthcare delivery. And thank you for just outlining all of those points, and really encourage people to maybe go back and listen to each of those stepwise again to see perhaps where it applies, if they're not if you're not in the research community specifically, where you can apply some of these principles to your work environment or to your profession. It's certainly not just relevant to healthcare or medicine or the research community. I don't know if you have any comments you wanted to make there. Otherwise, we could kind of go in another direction. But any thoughts before we move on?
I have a couple of comments. I mean, I think that the scientific community is fundamentally truth-seeking, and it's not perfectly truth-seeking. So there are inefficiencies in the system, but I do think it's a truth-seeking system overall. And I think that, the proof is in the pudding, that it's brought us a lot of very, effective, useful information. But I think that there are some inefficiencies in the system. And I think that, but because the system overall is truth-seeking, it is therefore a system that improves itself and becomes more truth-seeking over time by improving its own methods. I don't know enough about medicine to know whether that's also the case, but I would hope, as you say, that there are some pretty good parallels there.
Yeah.
And also, another thing to comment on what you were saying earlier, I think, as you said, people behave according to their incentives, and there are certain incentives that cause people to not want to replicate studies right now. And those are that, replication's kind of boring, and it doesn't demonstrate your scientific capabilities very well. It doesn't get you grants. It doesn't get you acclaim from your peers. It doesn't get you promotions. And so, those are the incentives that are creating our current situation. And if we change those incentives, I'm sure that we could change the situation. And, the number one way to do that is to give money to replication efforts. And also perhaps to create, institutes or labs or specific positions that are specifically designed to do replication studies, so that there is some, systematic effort happening and some kind of like acclaim, some acclaim associated with that. But I think we could definitely do it. And there are efforts in this direction, but probably not as much. It's a tough issue. Again, replication is a tough one. It's tough to get people excited about doing the same study that somebody's already done.
Yeah, I certainly, it just that that novelty piece, as you describe in the book, and what drives us to make decisions. You put it, I think, perfectly. It's kind of boring to want to try to answer a question that seems to have already been answered, even if it really isn't to the degree of certainty that we would probably want to maybe influence our decisions. I really liked your acknowledgement of the education piece, and it's amazing hearing you're like, well, I was just kind of thrown to the wolves to figure it out on my own, what I was supposed to do. And I wasn't even given a framework of, these methods were out here, these statistical analysis is available to you. And it sort of, it opens up and it points to this dramatic need for education about, as you said, research methods and how to vet a research study. I'd say, I'm very young, 27 years old, but I am, at least for my generation, when I was in middle and high school, the internet and Google was really just kind of becoming a thing. And I remember doing research papers, and we didn't really have, there was no rule on a limit on internet resource, website resources, because it wasn't an issue. People were still reading books. We went to the library. I remember taking notes on note cards and using primary resources. And, but we're in an age now where our issue is not being informed or being uninformed. It's being misinformed or over-informed. It's how do we handle all of the information inputs and be able to vet certain resources on their relevance, identifying bias in the studies designs, and it's a huge fundamental piece of education that I think actually needs to start in elementary school. I mean, just in a foundational conceptual framework for how we learn is being able to realize where a resource is coming from, but more specifically, I think, as it relates to this question within the research community, I think, and this is just my opinion, but I was drawn to your page and your blog because of your ability to, one, not only make some of the scientific literature more accessible, but to point out the relevant bias in the study. And we've been using bias here, and it kind of has a negative connotation, but it's just it's not meant to be a negative term. It's simply just recognizing, as you said, if I'm a researcher doing this study, I'd like for the outcome I'm studying, I'd like to see a positive outcome or what I'm expecting. I wouldn't make a decision going to pursue in this hypothesis if I didn't have a decent belief that, or there was a high likelihood I would achieve that outcome. It's the same way of you describing, going to get food. If I'm going to go to my, drive an hour to this restaurant that has amazing food, I want to be pretty dang sure that it's going to be open when I get there. So there's, we talk about bias, that, has this connotation, but we just need to recognize it as an objective term. But what I'm kind of curious if you can share, and you embed this in your blog posts and on your site, but what are some of your techniques or perhaps your framework for being able to identify bias or potential, red flags in a scientific paper as you approach it, and then, how you translate that into a blog post for the lay audience?
Yeah. So there are a few different things that I do. One of the things that I think is really important is to understand statistics, at least on a basic level, and understand how they are best applied and how they interface with proper study design. I think that is very important. So, for example, if you're evaluating a randomized controlled trial, there are a cluster of common problems that I often see in randomized controlled trials that greatly limit their evidence value and often make the results fairly misleading. So randomized controlled trial, first of all, needs to be pre-registered. And any modern randomized controlled trial, any that's being published these days, needs to have been pre-registered. And that's what I was talking about earlier. It basically locks you into a specific method and prevents you from playing around with your methods until you get the result that you want. It also protects you too. It protects you against other people coming in and saying that you played around with your results to get what you wanted. You can point out, you can say, well, actually, before I even did this experiment, I had laid out exactly what I wanted to do. This is actually something that Kevin Hall has used to his advantage recently. So he did these studies for NUSI, Nutrition Science Initiative, kind of refuting some of these ideas about insulin causing obesity. And then folks like Gary Taubes and others who were invested in this idea came back and said, oh, well, you're just manipulating those data to say what you want them to say. And Kevin Hall went back and he said, well, look, this study was pre-registered. I did it exactly how I said I was going to do it. You knew how I was going to do it because you saw the pre-registration. So you can't come back now and say I didn't do it right. So it's a way to protect yourself as well against other people accusing you of doing those things. And so pre-registration is very, very important. In the pre-registration, they need to have declared a primary outcome. What that means is you say, well, I'm going to do this randomized controlled trial to test like the effect of saturated fat on blood pressure, for example, and I'm going to collect, 20 different measurements, all, cholesterol and blood pressure and flow media dilation and urinary variables and body weight. I'm going to collect like 20 different things, but what this study is really about is blood pressure. And that way you can't just, after the fact, you can't say, oh, well, this study was really about the, amount of, body weight changes or something else that wasn't your actual primary goal, but you just happened to get a significant finding on that. You can't do that switch if you declare your primary outcome in advance. Also, applying appropriate statistical adjustments to account for the number of statistical tests they perform. So typically, our typical statistical significance threshold is one of 5%. So basically, if you get a p-value of less than 0.05, what that means is that there is a 1 in 20 chance or less that your result could have arisen by chance. So it's unlikely to have arisen by chance. But there are ways to undermine that. So if you do 40 different tests on one randomized controlled trial, one data set, you do 40 different tests on it, you're going to get on average, you're going to get 2 positive findings that are completely from random chance. Because again, there's up to a 5% chance, each test you do, there's up to a 5% chance that it could arise from random chance. And so you have to do an adjustment, a statistical adjustment for that. And something like the Bonferroni correction is a common one that's used. And that basically makes the p-value threshold more stringent to account for the fact that you're testing all these different things. And so this is something that applies particularly for secondary outcomes. And so did they apply some adjustment like that? Because if they didn't, and they did 20 different tests and one of them significant, then you might as well just ignore it because it's probably random chance. But I mean, this is the kind of stuff, these are the kind of considerations that don't get factored in when, news reports are getting reported in the media. When science is getting reported in the media, you get these stories that, there was some idiosyncratic finding in some paper that got trumped up because it's weird or, contrary to popular beliefs or whatever. A lot of times it's wrong. It's a secondary finding in a study that was not adjusted for multiple comparisons, and it likely is just random chance. So I think that's a really important one. I think also understanding the difference between observational and experimental data. So observational data, you're correlating things rather than actually manipulating a variable and measuring the results. And observational data can definitely be useful, but it has limitations, and it doesn't necessarily, if there's an association, for example, between eating carrots and your fingers falling off, that doesn't necessarily mean that the carrots actually caused your fingers to fall off. They could be associated with some other thing that people who eat carrots do, such as using a bandsaw. So I think understanding the difference between those two things is important. Also, I think another heuristic that's pretty useful for people trying to understand evidence in a field is to pay particular evidence to meta-analyses. Look for meta-analyses if you can. These are studies that mathematically and statistically aggregate all of the studies that have been done on a particular question. They tend to be more reliable than individual studies. But I think it's important to know how to evaluate them too. If you can, read a textbook on meta-analysis and understand how to judge the quality. And pay particular attention to tests for publication bias, because there are techniques for meta-analysis that you can use to detect publication bias, which can tell you if the primary literature is likely to be biased in one direction or another. So, for example, if you search around on the association between carrots and fingers falling off, and you find a bunch of studies showing that they do, that there is an association, then the meta-analysis comes in and it says there's massive publication bias. That may mean that there were actually a bunch of studies showing that there's no association that didn't get published. And so that's kind of an important thing to know if you're trying to really get to the bottom of the question you're interested in. And then another thing I would say, second to last one, if you need to evaluate the claims of a field, such as what people are saying in a review paper, I think that comprehensive literature searches are really useful. So like if you're reading a review paper and you're kind of skeptical about some of the claims, or you're afraid someone might be biased, by the way, this is a tool that I use a lot in my writing. I'll just do a literature search and try to find every paper I can on a particular question, and every randomized controlled trial or every observational study. And then I'll say, overall, does this body of evidence corroborate the point that's being made? Because a lot of times what you'll find is that people, even, highly capable, respected scientists, will cherry pick the crap out of data and only cite the few things that are most convenient to their argument. And so if you do a comprehensive literature search, if you do a good job and you really identify all the studies, you can get an idea of what the actual body of evidence says and whether people are representing it accurately in the literature and in review papers, which is obviously a place where you would often end up if you're first trying to understand a particular area. And then the last thing I would say is it's really important to know your own limitations. And this is a really important one that I've been coming to understand more and more over time. If you aren't knowledgeable in a particular area, you should be reluctant to conclude that you know better than the experts in that area. And that's not to say that the experts are always right, but if you want to learn how to build a wall, you ask a mason, you don't ask a baker. And that is because the mason has years and years of experience building walls. And so I think that you ignore experts at your own peril until you have a level of knowledge that is sufficient to be able to differ from them in a meaningful way.
Well, I could certainly take this down a few more rabbit holes, but to honor your time and to maybe direct this towards a close, I was kind of thinking there's so many pieces there in that final response, and incredibly helpful for me. So thank you for giving me some additionally another framework to be able to look into literature. And I love everything seems to keep coming back to some of these principles of that you outline in your book of why we do the things that we do. And I think of this idea of expectancy. And you I think described this, I don't know where exactly, but in fast food, we talk about McDonald's, and you're thinking in this moment, I want a Big Mac, and you're nearly 100% sure no matter which McDonald's you go to, you're going to get the same Big Mac you had last time, and you're going to satisfy that desire. And so that expectancy, you pretty much know what you're going to get. And, I've found as I've tried to vet resources, I've tried to identify certain, through certain methods, certain areas, certain resources that I can expect are going to give me the highest quality evidence with the least likelihood of some of these biases that we've been talking about. But that being said, I still, we have to recognize you can't, just because you expect that researcher A or that this institution, because of what they've put out before, has been very helpful and met all those check marks, doesn't mean another research study or something, another product that they give is going to meet that same standard. And I think a practical example for me in medicine, I've really been blessed that some of our education is focused on, as I mentioned before, this idea of how do we vet the medical literature to see what's most relevant. And then even more specifically, this concept of what's called patient-oriented evidence that matters. So not just some statistical significance, but did you find something as a primary outcome that was meaningful clinically to the patient, not like flow velocity diameter, or I'm just making things up, of a blood vessel. And so one of the main areas, especially in primary care, where we go to receive some evidence, is Essential Evidence Plus, and they have these poems, this patient-oriented evidence that matters. And the majority, I won't even try to put a percentage, but they do a very thorough job of presenting things that are relevant and providing, pointing out potential biases and the level of evidence for certain studies. And so I've gotten to the point where I expect pretty relevant, high-quality findings from these poems, and I get one every day. But I remember one day going into my inbox, my email, and the title of the poem was like evidence that chocolate worsens acne vulgaris, and it's sort of like, wait, I didn't come to read the New York Times health blog. I'm already like, so what does this say? So I want to look at what they point out, and I won't go into too much of the details, but essentially they had their study was two groups crossover, and they had used jelly beans and like Hershey's milk chocolate, and then took photos and rated the number of pustules and pimples, and they felt that they controlled for glycemic load was their main control, so the equal amount of sugar in the jelly beans and equal amount of sugar in the milk chocolate, and they found a statistical significance that there was worse acne following the ingestion of the chocolate as compared to the jelly beans. And I actually got the study. It was very interesting, just study to look at, and already on my mind, and many people are sitting here like in this space are like, what do they account for dairy? I know, not that I'm not going to get into the evidence about dairy, but there's people talk about dairy as potentially being immunogenic food, a pro-inflammatory food for certain people that could contribute to an inflammatory cascade that could result in, and that was nowhere, in this, they did not control for that. And I was just like, that's a glaringly obvious thing to me. And like I said, I don't want to get in the details, but it was just like, how did this make it into an essential evidence like poem? This is one, it's just like, it's very biased. If you just read the title, it's like, you're already seeing what you think what the measure or the outcome is, and if you don't actually look at it and vet it in any way, there's really nothing, no grounds to stand on. And so I see that, alongside other things that are much, much more relevant and validated, and it just like, it made me sort of cringe. I was like, I can't just take this stuff, not that I was taking it at face value, but I had a high expectancy for this essential evidence plus for these poems. And so now every time I look at them, if there's something that I'm a little, it doesn't seem quite right with me, I look more into it, and what comes out oftentimes is something that's not as rosy as that quick, succinct conclusion that they're creating, which is the same issue we find in health news, is that can we just distill it down into something that sounds really sexy and seems relevant, but may be completely distorted from what they actually studied or found, and have to be cautious now and come back to that expectancy. And really, there's nothing that seems sacred or that is cannot be influenced by these biases. And like I said, it was kind of a tangent and maybe irrelevant for some people listening, but I just wanted to kind of put it in perspective and to see, we can't just take things at face value and use some of the frameworks and the techniques that you've given us in this discussion, and to be able to come to your own conclusions and identify where you're going to get your findings. Are you simply just going to look at the New York Times Health or Washington? Like if that's the only source of your health or nutrition news, then just recognize you're only getting it from one input, and perhaps you need a greater breadth of inputs. So I guess to kind of bring this to a final close, I want to just leave it open for you to perhaps share any last pieces of wisdom or any thoughts that you think would be really helpful for our audience, for who's listening.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else off the top of my head.
Okay. It's been, we've talked for a little while, so I think people are probably like, it's time to take a break. But thank you so much, Stephan, for sharing this conversation. And I guess I'm really excited because I think I'm going to be out in Seattle the first part of September for the Ancestral Health Symposium. And I don't know if you're presenting, but I don't think you're not allowed to leave, because I need a reunion. I need to repay your visit to Charlottesville.
I am speaking.
Well, wonderful. Well, in the meantime, I'll certainly stay in touch. And can you give people, and we've kind of talked about it throughout, but in the book, can you give people ways to maybe get in contact with you or follow some of your work? I know it's been so impactful to me, and I want people to follow you.
Yeah, sure. So my current website is stephanguyenet.com. And in case that's difficult to spell, you can also get there through typing wholehealthsource.org. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @WHSource. I periodically write articles for various media outlets. I still publish a paper every now and then. You can find that on PubMed, or you can find it on Google Scholar. I've got a Google Scholar page if you want to see all my publications all together. And one last thing, I want to make a plug for the Center for Open Science, because they're at the forefront of a lot of the stuff that I've been discussing today about science self-correcting. And I think especially anyone who is doing research or who's really interested in the practices of the scientific method, I would encourage them to go onto that website and check out the TOPS guidelines and other things on there, and the tools that are available for sharing methodology and sharing methodology, sharing data, pre-registration, and just become involved in that community and start learning about it as soon as possible, so that it can improve your research and improve science in general.
Well, thank you again, Stephan, and looking forward to seeing you in a few months.
All right, thanks, Rob. Looking forward to seeing you too.
All right, be well.
Okay, you too.
Thank you for your presence and willingness to receive a new narrative, a passionate perspective, and perhaps a deeper sense of connection with our collective purpose. Please share this podcast with any and all that you believe will benefit from its intention to relieve one's doing and engage one's being. Please share your comments about the conversation on our podcast page and leave a review in iTunes so that the voices in this space can spread to all ears ready to receive it. Music credit goes to Dillingham for their song Vessel. Remain open, stay curious, and forever be love.
You walked on fire, and I know you tried.